The letter arrived on a Wednesday. A crisp white envelope with the Pinecrest Estates Homeowners Association seal embossed in gold on the upper left corner. Official, formal, designed to intimidate. Staff Sergeant Raymond Ray Kowalski, United States Marine Corps, retired, held it in his left hand, the one that still worked properly, and read it twice. Then a third time, slowly, the way a man reads something he can't quite believe is real. The fine was $25,000 for a wheelchair ramp. His wheelchair ramp built on his property. To get himself, a man who left both his full mobility and a significant piece of his spine somewhere in the Helmand Province of Afghanistan, into his own home. Ray set the letter down on his kitchen table. He looked out the window at the ramp his son had spent a weekend building. He looked at the signature at the bottom of the letter. Diane Whitmore, HOA President, Pinecrest Estates. And for the first time in a long time, Staff Sergeant Raymond Kowalski smiled. Not because it was funny, because he knew exactly what came next. Let me tell you about Pinecrest Estates. In the spring of 2021, it was one of those neighborhoods that made you believe in the American dream all over again. A quiet, planned community tucked into the gentle hills just outside Clarksville, Tennessee, about 12 miles from Fort Campbell, which is why a good third of the residents were either active military, veterans, or military families. The streets were named after trees: Sycamore Lane, Elm Court, Birchwood Drive. Ray lived at 14 Birchwood Drive. The lawns on Birchwood Drive were the kind of green that takes years to cultivate, deep, even, almost proud-looking. Neighbors waved from their driveways on Saturday mornings. Kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on. In the evenings, you could smell charcoal grills and hear screen doors banging shut and the distant sound of a lawnmower finishing its last pass before dark. It was the kind of street where people still left casseroles on your doorstep when something bad happened. It was the kind of street where something bad was about to happen. Not to the neighborhood, not to the street. To the wrong man. Staff Sergeant Raymond Kowalski had served the United States Marine Corps for 22 years. Born in Hamtramck, Michigan in 1974, the son of a steelworker and a school librarian, he enlisted at 18, the summer after he graduated from high school, because he said he wanted to do something that meant something. He deployed 6 times: Bosnia, Iraq twice, Afghanistan 3 times. His last deployment was in 2013. On a Tuesday morning in October, a roadside IED detonated beneath the vehicle he was riding in outside of Sangin in Helmand Province. The explosion killed 2 Marines instantly. Ray survived, but the blast compression fractured 3 vertebrae in his lower spine and caused permanent nerve damage to his right leg. He spent 11 months in rehabilitation at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. He was medically retired in 2014 with a 100% permanent and total disability rating from the Department of Veterans Affairs, meaning the United States government had formally recognized that Raymond Kowalski had given everything a man can give in defense of his country. He moved to Clarksville because his son, Derek, who worked as a contractor near Fort Campbell, lived there. He bought the house at 14 Birchwood Drive in October of 2019, a modest 3-bedroom ranch, single-story, good bones, a covered front porch where he could drink his coffee in the mornings. The only problem was the front steps. 3 concrete steps from the driveway up to the front door. For most people, nothing. For Ray, on his bad days, which came without warning and without mercy, those 3 steps were a wall. So in March of 2021, his son Derek spent a Saturday and most of a Sunday building him a wooden wheelchair ramp alongside those steps. Solid construction, pressure-treated lumber, painted the same cream color as the house trim. Clean, neat, functional. Ray's neighbors on Birchwood Drive, the Pattersons, the Nuyens, the Garcias, they all came out to help. Somebody brought lunch, somebody brought a level. By Sunday evening, the ramp was done and Ray walked up it the first time and said quietly, "Good work, son." That was Ray, economy of words, maximum meaning. His neighbors loved him. Kids on the block knew that Mr. Ray kept a bowl of wrapped candy near the front door and never told anyone not to knock. He coached youth baseball for 2 seasons before his back made it impossible to stand that long. He still showed up to every game and kept score. He had a black Labrador named Corporal. The dog was 9 years old, arthritic, and followed Ray everywhere at approximately the same slow, deliberate pace. There was one more thing about Ray Kowalski that mattered, one thing that almost nobody in Pinecrest Estates knew about. Before his final deployment, Ray had spent 4 years assigned to the Marine Corps Judge Advocate Division, the JAG Corps, working legal support for courts-martial proceedings. He wasn't a lawyer, but he understood how law worked. He understood evidence, documentation, and procedure with the same precision he brought to everything else. He understood specifically the Fair Housing Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and something called the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, Section 504. He'd read all three during his recovery at Walter Reed. He had time. We'll come back to that. Diane Whitmore moved into 16 Birchwood Drive, directly next door to Ray, in January of 2021. She arrived in a pearl-white 2020 Cadillac Escalade ESV, pulling a trailer loaded with furniture that cost more than most people's cars. The moving company she hired wasn't local. It was a white-glove operation out of Nashville, men in matching polo shirts carrying wrapped artwork and custom shelving units. Diane was 47 years old, formerly married to a real estate developer named Gerald Whitmore, from whom she had separated 18 months earlier and was in the process of divorcing. She had 2 adult children who did not appear to visit often. She had a small dog, a Pomeranian named Duchess, and a very large sense of what she was owed by the world. She had been the HOA president of Pinecrest Estates for 3 years running. She had run unopposed the last 2 elections because the one time someone tried to challenge her, she flooded their inbox with bylaw citations until they withdrew their candidacy. She drove the HOA with the enthusiasm of someone who had confused a homeowners association with a small country. Her first interaction with Ray Kowalski happened 4 days after she moved in. She knocked on his door on a Saturday morning, clipboard in hand, wearing a blazer over yoga pants, which was very much her signature look. Ray opened the door. She looked him up and down, looked at the ramp beside the steps, looked back at him. "I'm Diane Whitmore," she said. "I'll be your neighbor, and I'm also the HOA president, so I wanted to introduce myself and also let you know that that structure," she gestured at the ramp, "is going to need to be reviewed by the architectural committee before it can remain." Ray looked at her for a moment. "Good morning," he said. "I'm Ray." "Yes, well," she said, making a note on her clipboard, "we have standards to maintain in Pinecrest Estates. The aesthetic cohesion of the community is something we take very seriously." Ray looked at his ramp, cream-painted, neat, barely visible from the street. "I needed to get into my house," he said. Diane smiled the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "I'm sure there are options," she said, "but until the committee reviews it, I'd appreciate your cooperation." She handed him a card. "My contact information. Have a lovely weekend." She walked back to her car. Ray watched her go. Corporal the Labrador sat beside him and watched her too. The architectural committee review came back 6 weeks later, March 15, 2021. Denied. The committee, which consisted of Diane Whitmore, her friend Patrice Holloway who lived on Elm Court, and a mostly silent man named Roger Birch who seemed to vote however Diane told him to, had determined that the ramp was inconsistent with the architectural standards of the community, and installed without prior approval in violation of Section 4(2)(b) of the Pinecrest Estates CC and RS. Ray was given 30 days to remove it. He called the HOA office. He got Diane's voicemail. He left a calm, brief message explaining that he had a 100% VA disability rating, that the ramp was a medical accessibility modification, and that he believed it was protected under federal law. Diane called back 2 days later. "Mr. Kowalski," she said, with that smooth, patient tone of someone who is not actually being patient, "I appreciate your situation. I do, but the CC and RS are very clear and I'm afraid I can't make exceptions. The integrity of the process has to be maintained for everyone." "I'm not asking for an exception," Ray said. "I'm asking you to recognize that federal law supersedes your CC and RS." A pause. Well, Diane said, I suppose if you feel strongly about it, you're welcome to consult an attorney. She said it the way people say it when they're certain you won't. She did not know Ray had spent 4 years working JAG. She did not know Ray had already, before he even called her back, downloaded the full text of the Fair Housing Amendments Act of 1988, the ADA, and the Pinecrest Estates HOA governing documents. She did not know that he had already called the Tennessee Human Rights Commission. And she absolutely did not know about the notebook. Ray kept a small, brown, hardcover notebook, the same kind of write-in-the-rain field notebook he'd used on deployments. Waterproof pages, ballpoint pen, date, time, description, every call, every letter, every interaction, documented with the precision of a man who had once written sworn statements for courts-martial proceedings. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever tried to reason with someone in a position of small authority who has confused their power with righteousness? Someone who has never once considered that they might be wrong because the rules they're enforcing are their rules? Drop a comment and tell me what you did, because what Ray did next is something most of us wouldn't have thought of. He did nothing. He let the 30-day clock run out. He did not remove the ramp. He did not threaten. He did not argue. He mowed his lawn on schedule. He walked Corporal every morning at 7. He drank his coffee on the porch and waved to his neighbors. And he documented everything. The fine arrived on April 20th, 2021. $500 for failure to comply with the Architectural Committee ruling. Ray documented it, filed it, said nothing. 2 weeks later, another letter, $750 in additional fines, administrative processing fees, failure to respond. Ray documented it, filed it, said nothing. Now here's where Diane Whitmore made her first serious mistake, because up to this point, as absurd and illegal as her actions were, she had at least kept them within the narrow technical framework of HOA enforcement, misguided, discriminatory, but procedurally wrapped. Then she started talking. At the April HOA board meeting held in the clubhouse on Sycamore Lane with about 30 residents present, Diane brought up 14 Birchwood Drive by address. She didn't use Ray's name, but she said, "We have a resident who has repeatedly refused to comply with the architectural standards that every homeowner in this community agreed to when they purchased their property. We cannot allow individual residents to simply decide that the rules don't apply to them." 3 people in that room knew exactly who she was talking about. One of them was Marcus Patterson, Ray's neighbor 2 houses down. Marcus was also a veteran Army, 8 years, and Marcus started paying very close attention. After the meeting, Marcus called Ray. Ray thanked him, wrote it in the notebook. The following month, 2 more things happened. First, Diane Whitmore submitted a formal complaint to the City of Clarksville Code Enforcement Division, claiming that the ramp constituted an unpermitted structure and requesting an inspection. The city inspector came out on a Friday morning. He walked up and down the ramp. He examined the construction. He spoke with Ray for about 15 minutes. He issued no citation. He told Ray quietly before he left, "Between you and me, sir, this is one of the cleanest DIY ramps I've seen. Whoever built this knew what they were doing." Ray wrote it in the notebook. Second, Diane sent a letter on HOA letterhead to every home on Birchwood Drive. It didn't mention Ray by name, but it reminded all residents of the architectural approval process and noted that ongoing violations were being addressed. It was designed to embarrass, to isolate, to make Ray feel like the neighborhood was against him. Instead, it had the opposite effect. The Nuyens showed up at Ray's door with a casserole. Linda Garcia, who was on the HOA membership committee, quietly requested a copy of the HOA's full financial records, her right as a dues-paying member. And Marcus Patterson started making phone calls of his own. Diane Whitmore was playing checkers. Ray Kowalski was playing chess. And then, on a gray Thursday morning in May, Diane Whitmore made her second serious mistake. She called Montgomery County Animal Control and filed a complaint claiming that Corporal Ray's 9-year-old Labrador had been aggressively barking and posing a danger to neighborhood safety. Animal control came out. They spoke with Ray. They observed Corporal, who was lying on a dog bed on the porch and could barely lift his head to look at the officer. No citation was issued. But now Diane had filed a false report with a government agency. Ray wrote it in the notebook, 2 pages this time. The letter with the $25,000 fine arrived on a Wednesday in June 2021. 47 days after the first fine, the HOA's governing documents allowed for accelerated fine schedules in cases of willful and ongoing noncompliance. Diane had interpreted this, generously, for herself as justification for compounding the fines at an accelerating rate and then adding a community impact assessment fee of her own design. $25,000 payable within 60 days, or the HOA reserved the right to place a lien on the property. A lien on a disabled veteran's home for a wheelchair ramp. Ray read it twice, then he set it on the kitchen table next to his coffee mug, which said USMC in faded letters, and he looked out the window at Birchwood Drive. It was a warm morning. The Nuyens had their sprinklers on. A kid down the block was riding a bicycle with training wheels that wobbled confidently in both directions. Ray picked up his phone. He called his son Derek. He told him about the letter. Derek said some things that can't be repeated in polite narration. Then Ray called a number he hadn't dialed in about 18 months. A man named Gerald Ashworth, Colonel Gerald Ashworth, JAG Corps, retired, who was now a partner at a civil rights law firm in Nashville called Ashworth, Keene and Associates. Ray and Gerald had served together at Camp Lejeune in 2009 and 2010. Gerald had seen Ray work. He knew exactly how Ray kept his notebooks. Ray described the situation in 11 minutes, without editorializing. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Ray, he said, do you still have everything documented? From day one. Good. A pause. Ray, what they have done and what they are continuing to do is a federal civil rights violation. Multiple violations, actually. The Fine Housing Amendments Act explicitly protects reasonable modifications for persons with disabilities in HOA communities. They cannot legally deny this. They cannot fine you for it. And a lien threat. Gerald stopped. Ray, I need you to send me everything. Already scanning it, Ray said. Gerald Ashworth called his paralegal. His paralegal contacted the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. That office assigned a case number within 48 hours. And here is the part I want you to hear clearly. Because what nobody knew, what Diane Whitmore absolutely did not know, is that Pinecrest Estates was not the only place Diane had done this. Gerald Ashworth, in the course of his initial research, found 2 prior complaints filed with the Tennessee Human Rights Commission against HOAs where Diane Whitmore had previously been an officer. Both complaints involved residents with disabilities. Both had been informally resolved, meaning Diane's HOAs had backed down quickly and quietly before formal proceedings began. There was a pattern. HUD investigators love patterns. Now let me pause again, because I want to ask you something. If you think Diane Whitmore was going to see this coming, if you think she had any idea what she had just stepped into, drop a comment. Because the next 3 weeks are something I promise you, you are not going to forget. Let me tell you what was happening in that brown, waterproof field notebook. 312 individual entries, spanning from January 15, 2021, the day Diane Whitmore first knocked on Ray's door, to June 23, 2021. Every letter, every phone call with timestamps, every HOA meeting minute that Ray had requested and received as a member in good standing. The city inspector's visit, the animal control visit, the names of every board member who voted on the architectural denial. And one more thing. When Linda Garcia had requested the HOA's financial records, her right as a dues-paying member, she had quietly shared copies with Ray, and what those records showed was interesting. The HOA's administrative processing fees, the ones appearing on Ray's escalating fine schedule, did not appear anywhere in the HOA's audited financial statements. They were not going into the HOA's reserve fund. They were not accounted for in the operating budget. Gerald Ashworth looked at those records for about 20 minutes. Then he made a second call, this one to the Tennessee Secretary of State's office, which oversees nonprofit corporations, which is what a homeowners association legally is. Then he made a third call to a contact at the IRS's tax-exempt organizations division. Because here's what nobody knew about Diane Whitmore. She had been collecting those administrative fees from Ray, and apparently from at least 2 other residents who had quietly paid rather than fight, and those fees were not appearing in the HOA's nonprofit filings. They were appearing instead as income on a personal LLC Diane had created in 2019 called Whitmore Community Management Solutions. The HOA's members were paying dues. Some of those dues, via the fee structure Diane had invented, were being routed through a process that looked, to the trained eye of a tax attorney who reviewed Gerald Ashworth's materials, an awful lot like embezzlement. Now here's what Ray did with this information. He did not post about it on social media. He did not go to the local news. He did not confront Diane in her driveway or leave a note in her mailbox. He gave it all to Gerald Ashworth and Gerald Ashworth's team. He made himself a cup of coffee. He took Corporal for his morning walk, and he waited. Because that's how Staff Sergeant Raymond Kowalski operated. You don't fire until you have the shot. And there was one more thing. One quiet detail from way back in January, the very first week Diane Whitmore moved in. When she had knocked on his door that Saturday morning and looked at his ramp, Ray had noticed something. She was carrying a clipboard, and on that clipboard, beneath the paper she was writing on, was a printed sheet. He couldn't read all of it, but he saw the header. Pinecrest Estates HOA Variance Request Form. The form that residents were supposed to be given automatically when a modification was flagged. The form that, according to the HOA's own bylaws, Diane was required to provide to any resident facing a compliance issue before any fine could legally be assessed. Ray had never been given that form. Not once. Which meant that every single fine, every single letter, every single fee was procedurally invalid under the HOA's own governing documents. Diane had been so confident Ray wouldn't fight back that she hadn't even followed her own rules. Gerald Ashworth, when Ray mentioned this detail, was quiet for a long moment. "Ray," he said, "you beautiful, meticulous man." It was a Tuesday morning in July 2021. The air was thick and warm the way Tennessee gets in summer, heavy, humid, smelling of honeysuckle and cut grass. 7:42 in the morning. Diane Whitmore stepped out of 16 Birchwood Drive in a silk robe, coffee mug in hand, to retrieve her newspaper from the end of the driveway. She was almost back to her door when she heard the cars. 3 of them, black government plates, followed by a 4th vehicle, a Montgomery County Sheriff's Department cruiser, light bar off, moving slowly. They parked in front of 16 Birchwood Drive. Diane stood very still on her front step. 2 men and a woman got out of the lead vehicle. They were wearing business attire and carrying document portfolios. The woman showed Diane a badge. HUD Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. They were followed by a process server, a slight man in khakis carrying a large envelope, who handed Diane a thick sheaf of documents and said, simply, "You've been served." The documents included a formal HUD complaint filing on behalf of Raymond Kowalski, alleging violations of the Fair Housing Amendments Act of 1988, specifically 42 U.S.C. Section 3604, F. The provision protecting individuals with disabilities from discriminatory housing practices. A civil lawsuit filed in the United States District Court for the Middle District of Tennessee. Kowalski v. Pinecrest Estates HOA, Whitmore et al., seeking $185,000 in actual damages, $500,000 in compensatory damages for emotional distress and discriminatory targeting of a disabled veteran, and $250,000 in punitive damages. A referral letter from the Tennessee Secretary of State's office to the Tennessee Attorney General regarding financial irregularities in the HOA's nonprofit filings. And a separate correspondence from the IRS's Tax-Exempt Organizations Division indicating that Whitmore Community Management Solutions, LLC, was under review. The total exposure, legal, financial, regulatory, came to a figure that Gerald Ashworth's team had calculated at potentially over $1.2 million when you included the nonprofit penalties, IRS back assessment, and civil damages. Diane stood on her porch and read the first page of the lawsuit. The sheriff's deputy parked at the curb not because he had an arrest warrant, not yet, but because Gerald Ashworth had politely informed the county that the service was occurring as a professional courtesy. At no point during this entire proceeding did Raymond Kowalski appear outside. He was on his back porch drinking coffee, listening to the birds. Corporal was asleep at his feet. His son Derek had texted him at 7:45, "They're there, Dad." Ray had replied with 2 words, "Good morning." Now Diane Whitmore, it must be said, was not a stupid woman. She had operated with impunity for so long that she had confused the absence of consequences with the absence of risk. The moment she saw the HUD badges and the federal lawsuit, something changed behind her eyes. The clipboard certainty, the HOA blazer confidence, all of it gone. She went inside. She called her attorney. Her attorney called her back in 40 minutes and told her, and I'll let you imagine the specific words, that the situation was extremely serious. Meanwhile, by 9 o'clock that Tuesday morning, Birchwood Drive knew something had happened. People found reasons to walk their dogs, check their mail, stand at their front windows with coffee. Marcus Patterson stood openly in his driveway with his arms folded, watching. Linda Garcia came outside and stood on her lawn. The Nguyen's front door opened and closed 3 times. By noon, the HOA's emergency board meeting had been called. By 2 in the afternoon, the board had voted unanimously and with remarkable speed to immediately waive all fines against Raymond Kowalski, to formally approve the wheelchair ramp, to issue a written apology. Roger Birch, who had always voted however Diane told him to, voted for the waiver first. He didn't even wait to be called on. Diane Whitmore was not present at the board meeting. She had a migraine, her text to the board said. Her attorney, speaking on her behalf, informed the board that Diane would be resigning as HOA president effective immediately as part of a broader effort to resolve the pending legal matters. 19 days from the day the $25,000 fine arrived to the day Diane Whitmore resigned. 3 weeks. Gerald Ashworth, in a press release that was picked up by 2 Nashville TV stations and 1 local paper, noted that his client, a United States Marine Corps combat veteran, 100% permanently and totally disabled, had been subjected to a sustained campaign of discriminatory HOA enforcement that violated multiple federal statutes. He noted that the case had been referred to both HUD and the Tennessee Attorney General's office. He noted that his client was pursuing all available remedies. He did not mention the IRS review that was still ongoing. He didn't need to. After Diane resigned, Birchwood Drive got quiet. The kind of quiet that feels different from the quiet before, heavier, more deliberate, like a neighborhood exhaling. The 2020 Cadillac Escalade sat in the driveway of 16 Birchwood Drive for 3 weeks without moving. Lights off, curtains drawn, the little Pomeranian stopped appearing in the yard. Nobody brought a casserole. Nobody knocked on the door. At the next HOA meeting, the first one without Diane Whitmore running it, attendance was nearly double what it had ever been. Marcus Patterson was elected interim president on the first ballot, unanimously, without even being formally nominated in advance. He'd walked into the room and someone had just said his name and everyone had agreed. The administrative fee structure that Diane had invented was formally abolished. The board voted to have an independent auditor review 3 years of financial records. They also voted to formally adopt a reasonable modification policy in compliance with federal fair housing law, a policy that should have existed from the beginning. Several residents quietly approached Gerald Ashworth's office after learning about the case. 2 of them had paid Diane's invented fees. Gerald referred them to the ongoing matter. The moving truck came on a Saturday in late August. Gray sky, smell of rain coming. Nobody came outside to wave goodbye, not because they were gathered in protest, just because nobody did. Diane Whitmore loaded her things into a truck and drove away in the Escalade, and Birchwood Drive watched her go from behind closed curtains. Marcus Patterson was in his backyard with his family, having a cookout. Ray Kowalski was on his front porch. He noticed the truck. He watched it turn off Birchwood Drive onto Sycamore Lane and disappear. Then he looked down at Corporal, who was lying across his feet. "All right," he said, to no one in particular, to everyone maybe. The civil lawsuit was settled out of court in February 2022. The terms were confidential, as civil settlements often are, but Gerald Ashworth, in a brief public statement, noted that his client was satisfied with the outcome and that the settlement included a substantial monetary component. Sources familiar with the matter, and there were several because Gerald Ashworth was not the only attorney who'd been talking, suggested the figure was in the range of $340,000 to $380,000, inclusive of legal fees. The Tennessee Attorney General's investigation into the HOA's financial practices concluded in the spring of 2022. Whitmore Community Management Solutions LLC was dissolved by court order. Diane Whitmore entered into a consent agreement with the state requiring her to repay $28,400 in improperly collected fees to the HOA's member fund, plus interest and administrative penalties. The IRS matter was resolved separately, quietly, expensively. Diane Whitmore moved to a rented apartment in Murfreesboro. She did not join an HOA. Roger Birch, to his credit, became one of the more active members of the reformed Pinecrest Estates Board. He volunteered for nothing, said little, and voted correctly every time. It was perhaps the most useful version of Roger Birch the neighborhood had ever seen. Marcus Patterson served as HOA president for 18 months, then declined re-election because, he said, he had a life to live. The house at 16 Birchwood Drive sold in October 2021 to a young couple. He was active duty Army, she was a pediatric nurse. They moved in on a Saturday, and by noon the neighbors were over with food and folding chairs. They stayed until 10 o'clock that night. Ray Kowalski introduced himself, shook hands, and left by 8. He had an early morning. And here's the detail I want you to hold on to, the one we planted way back at the beginning. That cream-painted wheelchair ramp. The one that started all of this. After the settlement, Derek came back out to Birchwood Drive on a Saturday and tightened every bolt, replaced 2 of the boards that had weathered over the summer, and added a small carved wooden detail at the top post, a globe and anchor, the Marine Corps emblem, small and clean. It's still there. There's a reason we tell stories like this one. It's not just for the satisfaction, and I know you felt it because I felt it too. It's not just for the moment when the federal agents pull up and the clipboard falls and the small empire of petty cruelty begins to crumble. We tell these stories because they remind us of something true. There are people among us who have given things we cannot fully imagine, who have stood in places we will never stand and held their nerve in darkness we'll never see. And when they come home, when they build a quiet life on a quiet street and ask only for peace and a ramp to get into their own house, they deserve exactly that. They are not asking for more than they've already earned. Diane Whitmore looked at Staff Sergeant Raymond Kowalski and saw a target, an old man with a bad leg and a friendly dog, someone who would pay rather than fight. She did not see 4 years of JAG experience. She did not see 312 notebook entries. She did not see a man who had survived an IED in the Helmand Province and come home with half his mobility and all of his disciplines still intact. She did not see Gerald Ashworth's number in his contacts. And that right there is the lesson. You see, folks, the world is full of people who mistake silence for surrender, who look at a quiet man and see weakness, who believe that patience means the battle isn't coming. Those people are always wrong. Because the men and women who have truly been tested, who have sat in the dark and held the line when everything inside them was screaming to break, they don't need to raise their voices. They don't need to make a scene. They just need time and the truth and someone like Gerald Ashworth on speed dial. Never mistake a quiet man for a weak man. Never mistake patience for permission. And never ever pick a fight with a veteran who has already survived the worst thing you can imagine, because they've been preparing for you their entire lives and they didn't even know it. They just kept the notebook. This story is inspired by real events and public court records. Names, locations, and specific details have been changed or dramatized for storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to real individuals is coincidental.